to get a room. He would go to an inn to get a room. No, to find somewhere to stay. At present, though, he was in a field of dead bodies. Shan Qinghua hesitated a bit, then tipped that load of Qingjing Peak's heavy, useless nuisance right off the cart the way he'd taken out the trash. He hauled Mo Beijing onto it, face down, so as to conceal the face that made him lose control every time he looked at it. For the time being, he couldn't return to Changqiu Mountain. No one there would realize anything was amiss too quickly. This trip was supposed to last 7 days, and only 2 had passed. To stand steadfast by this demonic young heir and protect him while he had been weakened by a sneak attack. What a wonderful opportunity to garner some goodwill! While comforting himself with this justification, Shan Qinghua huffed and puffed as he pushed that large flatbed cart toward the city. To rent the room, Shan Qinghua spent the secret stash he'd been saving these last few years. At this point, he was only an average run-of-the-mill outer disciple, and he didn't have the authority to manage accounts or draw from the sect coffers. Renting a room already stretched the limits of his economic ability, so, as a matter of course, it was a single room. So, as a matter of course, there was only one bed. Who this bed belonged to was also a matter of course. Of course it was for himself! For a while, Shan Qinghua sprawled out on the bed like a dead starfish. After he had finished stretching out his muscles and bones, he crawled up and hauled Mo Beijing onto it. This was necessary. Mo Beijing was already in a bad mood and quite the temper after being injured. If he awoke to find himself lying on the ground or scrunched up into a chair, could Shan Qinghua expect to keep his life? There was no question that Mo Beijing wouldn't stop to consider the truth of the situation before rewarding him with an icicle through the chest. They had just passed by a medicine stand, and Shan Qinghua had bought a bit of such and such ointment. Although, given Demon's unusually strong vitality, he could probably just toss him in a corner and ignore him, and no matter how large a hole had been poked into him, it would gradually close. However, since Shan Qinghua had decided to cling to those thighs, he knew he had to discard all reservations and display his sincerity. As a self-proclaimed, quote, frank and honest reprobate, unquote, Grey Master Airplane shooting towards the sky looked down on hypocrites who kept up the aloof pose of facade despite clearly wanting to cling to people's thighs. He boldly scooped up a large lump of ointment and shoved it into the hole above Mo Beijing's kidney until it was more or less closed, then flipped him over, arranging his hands palms together in a Sleeping Beauty pose. After spending some time admiring this perfect face, which he had modeled after his mind's eye ideal, he pillowed his head on his arms and fell asleep on the outer edge of the bed. The summer night was stifling hot. Even with the window open, not a wisp of cool breeze flowed in. After tossing and turning for half the night, Shan Qinghua had finally managed to doze off when someone suddenly shoved him to the ground with a kick to the rear. Shan Qinghua was nearly scared to death. Scrabbling, he fled beneath the table and turned his head in a panic. Mo Beijing sat straight up on the bed, eyes shining with blue light like an overcharged battery about to explode. Shan Qinghua had thought up his lines long ago. He beat his chest and stomped his feet, saying with deep expression, "My king, you're finally awake!" Mo Beijing was unmoved, looking at him coldly. "Do you remember who I am?" Mo Beijing didn't respond. Shan Qinghua felt not a bit of embarrassment. Delightedly entertaining the possibility of amnesia, he barreled onward. "We met on our little road just a moment ago. I said I would follow you for the rest of my life, my king, as close as... Mo Beijing cut him off. Why were you hugging me just now? As a little padded jacket, Shan Qinghua started. What did you say? I did what just now? You were hugging me. A sudden realization, thunder from a clear sky. Sleeping in this damn heat was like being baked in a furnace, and Mo Beijing's body temperature just happened to be cold. In a muddled state of sleep, Shan Qinghua had subconsciously moved towards the cooler side of the bed, and the closer he got, the cooler and more comfortable he'd become. No wonder he had dreamed of a giant popsicle around which he'd happily wrapped his 4 limbs like an octopus as he licked and cried happy tears. Shan Qinghua carefully peeked at Mo Beijing's face and neck. Seeing no unusual shine of moisture upon them, he couldn't resist letting out a thankful prayer. Ah, your body was ice cold, he said cautiously. I was afraid you weren't going to make it, so I was holding you. At this, Mo Beijing scoffed. Fool. This is my natural state. The colder my body is, the better my condition. I'm not a human for whom cold means the onset of death. Shan Qinghua carefully measured Mo Beijing's every word and expression. Seeing him relax a bit, a smile soon spread across his face. Just when he was about to slither out from under the table like a snake crawling up the stick used to strike it, Mo Beijing suddenly recovered his ice-cold demeanor. Go on. Try moving another inch. Shan Qinghua was instantly scared stiff. He pathetically clung to the table leg, curled in a ball under the table like a hamster. What do you want? Asked Mo Beijing. I don't want anything, Shan Qinghua said shamelessly. I just want to follow you for the rest of my life. Mo Beijing acted as if he hadn't heard. You're an unding peak outer disciple. Shan Qinghua kept feeling that whenever anyone stressed these 3 words, quote, unding peak, they carried an undertone of prejudice. For fear that Mo Beijing would deem him useless and do away with him forthwith, he stuck out his head. My king, listen to me. I'm young, so I have opportunities to rise in status. Get back. Shan Qinghua hurriedly retreated to safety. Satisfied with this distance, Mo Beijing said, The assistance you lent me, was it for opportunities to rise in status? As proud and arrogant as expected, he hadn't used, quote, save, a verb that would have implied being the weaker party in the situation, but rather, quote, assist, which implied he had been merely support. Shan Qinghua chuckled, playing dumb. If he said no, the credibility rating of his response would be less than 3%. But if he said yes, Mo Beijing rather looked down upon such spineless reprobates. This was the reason Mo Beijing hadn't thought twice about killing the original flavor Shan Qinghua, because he had never planned on letting him live in the first place. How could Shan Qinghua shamelessly admit that he had done it just to grind friendship XP? Fortunately, Mo Beijing had already come to a conclusion, and he slapped the label of, quote, greedy for life, afraid of death, slippery bootlicker, sect sellout, unquote, right onto Shan Qinghua. He didn't need him to respond before letting out a cold snort, and he lay down once more. Shan Qinghua waited for a long time, not moving another step. Had Had he received a concession for the time being? Or had Mo Beijun fainted again? In the end, Shan Qinghua didn't dare to rashly approach and remained crouched under the table, making do for the rest of the night. After struggling with himself for half the night, as soon as he woke the next morning, Shan Qinghua officially began a busy day of being ordered left and right. By noon, Shan Qinghua had worked hard without complaint, running up and down the stairs more than 20 times and changing the water in the bathtub 7 or 8. This water was to help Mo Beijun heal his wounds. Soaking in water was the best option for this ice-powered great lord, after all. But a perfectly good tub of warm water didn't last an hour before he turned it into icy slush. Shan Qinghua huddled into the corner, chewing on some rations he had with him while watching Mo Beijun undress, nursing both extreme envy toward and extreme admiration for the figure and abs he had longed for in his dreams. As he watched, he suddenly realized Mo Beijun had stopped undressing and was staring at him, an unhappy look on his face. Shan Qinghua chewed a couple more times, hurriedly swallowing a few extra bites, just in case Mo Beijun suddenly demanded he hand over his rations. "You're very fishy," Mo Beijun said. "Not fishy," Shan Qinghua said hurriedly. "This one is sweet." He didn't have the chance to eat more than a couple of bites before a few strips of black shadow hit him full in the face. So Shan Qinghua couldn't stand around fishily anymore, as he had to go wash his newly claimed master's clothes. Indeed, this young demonic heir had only brought one change of clothes, and now it was full of holes and blood and sweat. How could he wear them any longer? Obviously, they had to be sewn and mended and washed and dried. Low fantasy xianxia worlds doggedly adhered to these kind of unromantic, dismal, and disgusting principles of realism. Shan Qinghua swore that if he ever had the opportunity to change back into Great Master Airplane shooting towards the sky, his next book would be the high fantasy xuanhuan of the sort where wild plot bunnies ran rampant and signs were fed to the dogs. Characters would weave clouds into garments and trim the moon into a belt, and all manual labor would be resolved with the twitch of a pinky finger. There would never again be a need for dismal existence like those of Anding Peak's disciples. Shan Qinghua considerately patched the hole in Mo Beijun's clothes that had once covered his kidney, wrung them dry, and hung them up in the room. He felt he had made a very good show of himself that day. So, that night, with the confidence of the ignorant, he thickened his face and crawled toward the bed. But before he got close, history repeated itself and he was again kicked off. He sat on the ground, tears in his eyes and voice trembling. "My king, you won't let me on the bed. What if during the night you get cold, thirsty, hungry, or want to turn over? What then?" Mo Beijun lifted an eyebrow. Easily seen to. So he ordered Shan Qinghua to find a length of cord. One end was tied to his finger, while the other was tied to Shan Qinghua's finger. In your dreams, it was tied to his neck, nothing more. Shan Qinghua lay on the ground like a corpse. The fuck, he thought to himself. Dogs have it better than I do. The only comforting thought he could scrounge up was that at least Mo Beijun wasn't some sort of pervert. The other end of the cord could have been tied to his beep. That treatment would have been truly inhumane. Shan Qinghua spent only 4 days suffering such hardship, but he honestly felt the days dragging by like years. Even his nights were an unceasing nightmare. On the final day, in the middle of the night, Shang Jinghua was sound asleep as he once again dreamed. This time, he dreamed he was still in the real world, crying and weeping at a computer screen. Beside him was a fiendishly large man holding a thorny cucumber shaped like a rather hairy lower leg. He was fiercely thrashing airplanes shooting towards the sky's face, and as he thrashed, he roared, "Everything you write is unhinged trash!" Airplanes shooting towards the sky dodged the cucumber like his life depended on it as he strove to explain himself. "It's been so long since I've updated, Cucumber Bro. Don't be like this." "Then hurry up and update." With this, Peerless Cucumber tied a corded loop around his neck. Submerged in great suffering, Shang Jinghua fought to wake up only to find the cord still tightening around his neck. Following it with his gaze, he found Mo Beijing lying on the bed, mechanically pulling on the cord tied to his hand. "My king, what do you require?" Shang Jinghua asked lifelessly. Only after asking a couple more times did he discover that Mo Beijing wasn't tormenting him on purpose. He was profoundly passed out and was merely tossing and turning in extreme discomfort while unconsciously yanking on the thing in his hand to try to find some relief. As the unfortunate soul around whose neck the other end of the cord was tied, Shang Jinghua's eyeballs were nearly squeezed out of his head under the force of the pulls. Mo Beijing creased his brow, restlessly flicking back and forth. Shang Jinghua quietly tiptoed to his bedside. When he saw the shallow beads of sweat seeping from Mo Beijing's smooth forehead and felt the faint heat radiating from his clothes, he understood. The wound on Mo Beijing's back looked just like a little cut, not anything alarming, but, in truth, the situation was a bit serious. It was just that he was stubbornly trying to ride it out and had refused to admit it. In addition, it went without saying that the ice demons hated hot weather more than anything. It was the height of summer, and the wound was possibly becoming something similar to inflamed or even beginning to fester. His kidney was healing so slowly. Did he need some sort of medicine to strengthen it a bit? The Morbei clan needed the cold. If they didn't have the cold temperatures, they just had to make their own. Shang Jinghua muttered his sleeping posture is really so fucking bad, then accepted his fate and went out. Unhindered by the annoyance he earned for knocking on doors in the middle of the night, he asked for 2 leaf fans, a basin of water, and 2 clean towels. He returned and wiped Mo Beijing down, then placed a wet towel on his forehead, taking up 1 leaf fan in his left hand and the other in his right. He fanned like his life depended on it. He fanned and yawned incessantly, fanning until his eyes were blurry. Half dreaming and half awake, he seemed to see Mo Beijing's eyes open. Icy blue pupils were bright and cold under the moonlight, like a pair of magnificent and eerie chrysoberyls. This scene was profoundly frightening. Shang Jinghua shuddered and opened his eyes wide to take a better look. But Mo Beijing's were clearly shut tight. Once Shang Jinghua awakened, he realized there was a major problem. During the night, he had become dizzy from the heat. As he waved and waved those leaf fans, he had managed to topple over on the bed and fallen asleep. Too close, too close! Thankfully, Mo Beijing was still asleep. If he'd woken, he might well have kicked Shang Jinghua's brains clear out of his head. Shang Jinghua hurriedly jumped off the bed and lay down in the corner of territory he had claimed for himself on the floor by the headboard. After a while, the bed frame began to creak lightly, and Mo Beijing finally sat up. Shang Jinghua hissed to himself. That had been too close. If he had woken up even a little later, he'd have been turned into a blood splatter on the spot. The next day, having obtained King Morbei's gracious permission, Shang Jinghua was finally able to see the light again and he went out on the street for a stroll. Well, actually, he had clung to Mo Beijing's thighs and wailed, "My king, my cultivation level isn't so high that I can eat when I want and abstain when I don't, like you can. If you don't let me go out to buy food, I'll starve to death and my corpse will stink up your room." He bought a bowl of thin congee to drink from a shop on a street corner. The congee was clear as water. When he looked down and glimpsed his own reflection, he beheld a chrysanthemum battered by the rain, a trampled mian, wan and sallow. Just as Shang Xinhua was wallowing in his wretched misery, he suddenly heard someone call him, "Marshal brother," from behind. He turned to see some 5 young men exuding immortal auras, their sleeves and hems fluttering in the breeze as they shouldered long swords and walked solemnly toward him. Comrades! His comrades from Changqiu Mountain sect. Right, 7 days had passed, so they had organized a group to come find him.